start.
Okay, so I'm just going to put some slides up because I want to talk about the election results, and it's probably easier if I've got those on the screen there. Hang on a second. So can you see the slides up? Are they up all right now? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, so hello everyone. My name's Caroline Gray. I'm a lecturer in politics and Spanish at Aston University in Birmingham. And so what I want to do is give you a brief introduction to what happened at the recent Catalan elections, and focusing particularly on what some of the negotiations are between different parties and why we're seeing quite a lot of parliamentary fragmentation in Catalonia that's affecting what's happening there. And I think when we look at the situation in Catalonia, many of you will know there's been a big pro-independence drive over the past decade or so in Catalonia. And what's interesting is how the different parties on the pro-independence side are taking different strategic approaches to the question of what to do next. So if we look at the election results on the screen there, we've got the 2021 elections that took place in February up at the top there, and I've also put the 2017 election results to compare. And the parties that I've circled in blue, those are your pro-independence parties. So on both occasions, your pro-independence parties got just over the absolute majority of seats. You need 68 seats for an absolute majority, and on both occasions, they've got about 70 something combined. Whereas the unionist parties, those which aren't circled, have ended up with slightly fewer seats combined. So in that sense, between 2017 and 2021, there hasn't actually been much of a change if we look at the size of the two blocks, the pro-independence bloc and the unionist bloc. But what we have seen is shifts within each bloc, and that's where things become interesting. So 2021, we can see that on the pro-independence side, the ERC party, that's your Republican Left of Catalonia, was the party that won the most seats. Whereas back in 2017, it was Junts per Catalunya. And Junts per Catalunya was actually the political force that had governed in Catalonia for quite a long time under various different names. So we've seen on the pro-independence side a shift in terms of which is the dominant party within the pro-independence camp. And similarly, on the unionist side, we've seen a shift away from the Citizens Party back in 2017 to the Catalan Socialists in 2021. So the PSC party there, that's your Catalan Socialists. So the Catalan branch of the party that's the main party in Spain at the moment. So when we look at those election results and we see this parliamentary fragmentation, and we focus particularly on the parliamentary fragmentation on the pro-independence side, this is something that's actually very interesting to look at, because if we think of Scotland and the nationalist movement in Scotland, it's very heavily dominated by the SNP. How is it that Catalonia has ended up with several different parties on the nationalist pro-independence camp? And what's been happening between them? Have they been collaborating together or competing with one another? So that's a bit what I want to look at and give you a bit of an introduction to, because it's quite important to understand those sorts of dynamics to see where Catalonia might be going forward. So when did the Catalan nationalist camp become so fragmented, and what have been the consequences for Catalan politics? So back in the 1980s and 1990s, you had the dominant force in Catalonia was your Catalan nationalist party, Convergència. And Convergència Democràtica de Catalunya was the party that led the main nationalist federation, Convergència i Unió. So I'll refer to Convergència, which is both the main party and the broader federation. And Convergència had an absolute majority of seats in the Catalan parliament up to 1995. It was the dominant party. It always won the elections, and for a long time, as I say, until 1995, it had an absolute majority of seats, so it didn't even need to collaborate with other parties. And Jordi Pujol was your Catalan president during that time. And Convergència stayed in power until 2003, before we saw a change in parties in power. But it lost that absolute majority from 1995 onwards. So that's when we started to see more of an increase in the number of parties gaining significant number of seats, including within the nationalist camp. And if we think about which parties actually began to contest Convergencia and become genuine competitors to it from the late 1990s onwards, you had your Catalan socialists, who were a unionist party, but actually from the late 1990s onwards, at the time, they adopted an ever more Catalanist approach, whereby they were seeking greater devolution for Catalonia. And so it wasn't a straightforward unionist party. They were seeking more and more devolution and advocating more and more rights for Catalonia. And you also had the Republican left of Catalonia, which is a pro-independence party, but for a while, in order to govern in Catalonia, it did moderate those pro-independence demands. And so we saw actually your Convergencia, your traditional Catalan nationalist party, ended up in opposition for a while between 2003 and 2010, when the Catalan socialists and the Republican left of Catalonia formed a left-wing coalition together with a smaller party, the Catalan Greens, and they governed in Catalonia. And what happened during those years when you had this left-wing coalition for the first time since Spain's transition to democracy and since the creation of the Catalan parliament in the wake of that transition to democracy? For the first time, you didn't have the Catalan nationalists in power. You had a left-wing coalition of some unionists and some pro-independence parties together, as where the left-wing aspect of that coalition was the most important. Well, what we started to see during those years was we actually saw that you had your traditional Catalan nationalists, the right-wing Convergencia, ending up in a sort of competition with the socialists and the Republican left of Catalonia. Each of these three parties, which had now were gathering important numbers of seats each, essentially wanted to become the dominant party in Catalonia. And you ended up with a sort of what has been described by some academics as an outbidding competition, as they were each trying to promise that they would do the most for Catalonia, that they would get the most devolution for Catalonia, etc., etc. So that was the scenario that we were in when you ended up with the Catalan nationalists coming back into power, Convergencia, from 2010 onwards. And then that coincided with a growing independence movement in Catalonia for various reasons. I haven't got time to talk about the different reasons, but basically from 2010 onwards, you did have your right-wing Catalan nationalists coming back in power, but you also had a growing independence movement, and those Catalan nationalists, if they wanted to stay in power and keep gaining votes again, they really needed to have an agenda that would allow them to compete successfully with the Republican left of Catalonia and also with the Catalan socialists. And during those years, when Convergencia was back in power, they decided to shift to a pro-independence agenda for various reasons. The pro-independence movement was growing in Catalonia for various reasons. And what's interesting is that they actually managed to ally together for quite a long time with other pro-independence forces. So for the 2015 Catalan regional election, you actually had Convergencia, your right-wing Catalan nationalists, joining together with the Republican left of Catalonia in a single list for the elections, which was the Junts pel Sí, the Together for Yes single list that I've circled here. They won 62 seats. So they actually managed to put aside their differences on various issues and join together to form a single list. And the CUP, which is a far left independence party, they didn't want to join the single list, but after the elections, they did actually decide to lend their support to this single list to enable them to govern, because you need an absolute majority of 68 seats to govern effectively, and Junts pel Sí was just below that. So you essentially had these different parties putting aside their left-wing and right-wing differences to a large degree in order to govern together and to prioritise the pro-independence agenda. And that happened again after the 2017 elections. You had your Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, your Republican left of Catalonia, Junts per Catalunya, which is a new form of what was once Convergencia, which evolved in a new way. They, together with the CUP, after 2017 elections, joined together again to govern effectively as to form a pro-independence government. But But what's happened now after the 2021 elections? You've again had those same parties winning seats, albeit slightly different numbers this time, and in a slightly different way, in that we have got the Republican left of Catalonia this time overtook Junts per Catalunya. And what we're seeing this time is that, in contrast to the agreements that they reached after 2015 and 2017 elections to try and put aside their differences on left-right issues, to put aside their differences on other issues that might not affect the immediate goal of trying to work towards independence, this time around, they're finding it more difficult to put aside their differences. The Republican left of Catalonia is trying to form a government, but is struggling because of the difficulties involved in seeking, in getting the support from Junts per Catalunya. So we have this scenario now where, in contrast to the collaboration we saw in previous years, we're seeing relatively more competition between these parties that's preventing the same level of collaboration. And the question is, will they manage to overcome that going forward to form a government? And there really are different factors that are affecting this competition. You've got competition between them over who should lead the pro-independence movement. As I say, the Republican left of Catalonia has overtaken Junts per Catalunya in these elections. So you've got that left-wing force has overtaken the more traditional centre-right force in Catalonia to be leading these new negotiations. So there's competition between them over who should lead the pro-independence movement, what the strategy should be going forward. You've actually got the Republican left of Catalonia has actually lent quite a lot of support to your socialist left-wing government in Madrid. Spain frequently has minority governments that need support from regionally based parties. And you've had your Republican left of Catalonia advocating, well, we should continue to try and work with Spanish central governments whilst we are part of Spain to try and reach some negotiations, whereas Junts per Catalunya is much more against that kind of collaborative approach and wants to take more of a unilateral approach to resolving the Catalan question. And then you've also got the left-right question. Even though these parties had managed to put aside their left-right differences in the past to try and move beyond that and focus just on the pro-independence question, now those left-right differences are coming to the fore again. So all of these factors are affecting their ability to reach an agreement to form a government after the elections. And so I'll leave it there and hand over now to Sandra, who I'm sure will talk more about all these challenges and what's going to happen going forward.
Thank you, Caroline. That's really fascinating. Thank you for talking to us about that. Yes, Sandra, if you'd like to continue.
Hello to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here collaborating with our beloved University of York and York Society. And it's also a pleasure to be here with Caroline, whom I haven't met yet, but I look forward to having the opportunity in the future to meet you in Spain or maybe in the UK. I prepared some slides. Let me see if I can here. Can you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So basically, you raised the question of what's next for Catalonia, and I'm gonna follow upon the lines raised by Caroline in her presentation. And what I wanted to do first, before talking about what's next, is to talk about what has happened so far and what is the point of departure, basically, and what are the things that are new and what are the things that remain the same in this very difficult scenario and this territorial conflict that has been present in Spain for the last 10 years with a more intense approach in politics. So there are several things that have remained the same since the last election. So you know that when I say the last election, I mean the election that took place in 2017, and Caroline has already explained the most important results and some of the very important steps in the way towards that election. we had an election just a few weeks ago, and I wanted to highlight how we arrived, in what context we arrived to that election. And there are several things that as I said, that remain the same. One was that there was a lack of normalized politics in Catalonia, given the judicial processes that have been going on, and given the situation of the imprisoned politicians. So even though we have experienced a pandemic, and even though Spanish and Catalan citizens were evaluating the situation in Catalonia very badly, we haven't seen any sort of punishment to the Catalan government. So we haven't seen that accountability has played a role, in a way, in this election. So I think that illustrates very well that we are living in a sort of non-normalized situation. The second characteristic is that there is, as Caroline has highlighted before, there is strong within bloc competition within the secessionist bloc. As Caroline said, one of the things that have been hampering moderation throughout the very last years has been that there is a process of competition between Junts per Catalunya and Esquerra Republicana, the two most important political parties within the secessionist bloc, for the leadership of the secessionist movement. And that competition, as a sort of race to the top, has prompted a sort of race to the top dynamic that has prevented moderation in the strategies among the most important secessionist actors. The third characteristics that actually also characterized secessionist movement in Scotland was that social movements had a very important role, and still have a very important role in accounting for the dynamics of the process. So one of the independent parties, pro-secessionist parties, is very much penetrated by social movements. And the problem with having social movements having a very prominent role in these dynamics is that social movements are less predictable. They are less predictable actors, and it complicates compromise, because it's more difficult for social movements to understand and to defend a narrative in which compromise between different political actors, between unionist and non-unionist and pro-secessionist parties, can be a potential solution to appease the territorial conflict. And finally, there was very low transferability across blocs, something that Caroline mentioned before. So before the election that took place in February 2021, just a few weeks ago, we knew that the probability of a non-independentist, a non-secessionist voter to vote for a secessionist party was very low. So we had two blocks very closed, with low permeability between them. So this was the situation before the last election. And actually, that was the situation before the previous election, the election that took place in 2017. But there are things that are new. There are new things that have come up after the election that took place in February. One is that there is a more fragmented parliament. This is an interesting issue to compare with Scotland, because the evolution in Scotland, in the Scottish pro-independent movement, has been to concentrate support around the Scottish Nationalist Party, but it hasn't quite been the same in the Catalan context. In Catalonia, instead of less fragmentation, what the party system has experienced particularly in the last election, has been more fragmentation. We have a new political party having representation in the Catalan parliament. The second characteristic that is new is that we have a less polarized parliament in Catalonia, because the two most important parties in each bloc, in the unionist and in the secessionist bloc, are more moderate. So on the one hand, we have that the most important political party in the secessionist bloc is now Esquerra Republicana, which holds a more pragmatist approach towards the territorial issue than Junts per Catalonia. And within the unionist bloc, the Socialist Party now is the predominant party, and the Socialist Party has a more moderate position upon the territorial issue than Ciudadanos, Citizens, the party that actually won the election in 2017. The third characteristic that is different in this election is that support towards independence is a bit lower than in the past, and support towards a federal structure, a federal model, a federal territorial model has increased around 5 percentage points since the last election, since the election in 2017, which is the last point of reference. And a very important issue that is the fourth different issue that is different now as compared to the context of the election that took place in 2017 is that people are less concerned on issues related to the territorial conflict. So when you look at public opinion data, what you can see is that just before the election that took place in February, you could see that people were more concerned about healthcare issues or about the state of the economy than about the relationship between Catalonia and Spain. And the last issue that I think it's important to understand that some things have changed if we compare the current situation to the situation that the situation in 2017, is that I think there is a little more room for ideology, for ideological issues to play a role in prompting, in creating new political alliances. So I think that, and this is something that I will mention in the last slide, I think there is more room for alliances, political alliances between left-wing parties, alliances that can cut across the territorial issue, the territorial conflict. So what are the next crucial steps so what is next actually in Catalonia as the question that you raised to inform this seminar discussion? Well, first, the most important thing is how the investiture will end. And the investiture will mark whether ideology and ideological alliances have more room to develop during this mandate, during the next 4 years. If ideological issues have a more prominent role than identity in accounting for political alliances and in turn in accounting for politics, for political action. The second important crucial step in the next months is what happened with the negotiation table between the Spanish and the Catalan government. This negotiation table was one of the conditions that Esquerra Republicana basically presented in order to support the current national government. The problem has been that this never-ending electoral cycle in which Spanish politics have been engaged in the last year has hampered developments of the negotiation table. And the negotiation table is very important to justify the pragmatist strategy that Esquerra Republicana has been trying very timidly, has been trying to pursue. Esquerra Republicana needs to show, in order to convince the more radical, the less moderate factions of the party needs to show that a pragmatist strategy, that bargaining with the central problem provides certain benefits for Catalonia. For instance, in what is going to be the fate of the imprisoned politicians, on what are going to be the investments that comes from the central government, or the transfers that come from the central government to Catalonia. So these are very important issues to reinforce the pragmatist strategy that Esquerra Republicana has been trying to pursue for the last year. If Esquerra Republicana is not able to show that bargaining with the central government can reap certain benefits for Catalonia, then it will be more difficult for this political party to resist the pressure from the more radical party within the pro-secessionist bloc, which is Junts per Catalunya. So I think that these are the three crucial steps that will condition how the situation in Catalonia and how the territorial conflict develops in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. That's really interesting. Thank you. And then Ignacio, did you want to finish off, wrap that up? And then we'll go to a Q&A. So if anyone's got any questions while they're on their mind, you can send them to me.
Then I'll try to be brief, and also my two colleagues did an excellent job in presenting the situation. So, so many of the things that I was actually thinking about saying haven't really been mentioned. I think that in terms of where this is coming from, I would like to start by saying that sort of the situation that now we have in Catalonia and in Spain has not been. I mean, Spain has sort of lived in a with certain level of territorial with territorial conflict for a long time, but this level of territorial conflict is quite new, and it's basically something that happened 10 years ago, and it's a post-crisis situation. So we were not necessarily having this level of conflict that we have now. And basically, I think it's interesting to at least see how the process started and how this has been developed. I think that what has happened in Catalonia was sort of a perfect storm that happened in 2010, 2011, in which a variety of issues, were combined and ended up having ended up putting the region in this sort of secessionist threat. So after 2009-10, we had a very strong economic crisis, and this obviously had an impact in Catalonia. There was, I think many other places, a political crisis. So the crisis of political representation in Spain has been very deep, as in many other places. So the feeling that politicians were not being, representatives enough, that basically that people felt very distant from the political elite and from the political class. And also in Catalonia, we can add at that point what we call like a centralization threat. So something that was not mentioned, I think that it was quite relevant in explaining why things, started off, was that so Catalonia passed with the left-wing coalition that Caroline mentioned. Catalonia passed a sort of new constitutional arrangement. It's like a regional constitution called Estatuto, and this was part of it was basically ruled as not constitutional, as against the constitution by the Constitutional Court. And that was sort of presented to the Catalan public as, last stage in the decentralization process, and sort of a process that was bringing to Catalonia some things that were not being, that basically could not be achieved during the transition. And actually this was a constitution that was passed by the majority of the basically was passed in a referendum in Catalonia. This, as I said, was ruled as not constitutional by the constitutional court parts of it. And this basically increased that feeling of grievance among part of the Catalan public. So the combination of a political crisis, an economic crisis, and this feeling of a sort of centralization threat that Spain will never concede, will never give enough autonomy to Catalonia, at least not enough level of autonomy that what part of the Catalan people, possibly the Catalan majority, would demand. Even the non-independence independence electorate demands more autonomy in average. That basically sort of made the independence process to start. Okay, and as in other places, we have seen that the effect, and this is something that sometimes when I mention this to some Catalan friends, they kind of don't see it that way. But I think that as we have seen increases in political fragmentation and increases in political polarization, new parties coming into the arena, more political fragmentation, and so on in other places. Basically, this has been almost everywhere in Europe, in which the political landscape has changed a lot in the last 10 years. In Catalonia, that has happened, but that has happened around the independence issue. And obviously, I think it's then important to mention that this starts with a change in the public opinion. It's a change in the public opinion that was basically, this Caroline was explained it quite well, that basically was followed by also a change in the elites. The elites somehow perceive, part of the elites, clearly the elites from the old moderate nationalistic parties, they perceive that they are losing the pulse of the public opinion, and instead of trying to, as you could have expected in another type of situation in which there was not that such perfect storm, instead of trying to, as could have happened, trying to lead public opinion, elites started to go after the public opinion. The public opinion moves, and we see this like in 2 years' time, the demand for independence goes from 20%, which was very stable since the arrival of democracy in Spain, till 2010, around there. In like 2 years' time, it doubles, and support for independence goes up to around 45%, even 50% in some surveys. So instead of trying to lead public opinion and try to negotiate with the Spanish government in a way and try to sort of bring new arrangements to the public, to their electorate, in that difficult situation of a political crisis and an economic crisis, the political elite of the nationalistic parties decides to sort of join the pro-independence movement. And they do it also in a way, and this also was mentioned by Sandra, and I think that it's also very relevant to explain where we have ended up. It leads in a way in which it's sort of, it's not only that they follow where the public opinion is going, they also do it in a way in which they don't try to, even if it's towards independence, to lead that public opinion. They do this as if it was a more collective process, and they try to absorb part of the social movements and the cultural leaders and other types of civic society leaders. And the problem is, as Sandra was mentioned, that again, the parties were never really able to discipline those social movements and those civic society leaders. On the contrary, the civic society leaders that were pro-independence, which had no electoral incentives and therefore no interest by themselves in winning elections, and also less interest in compromise, were always able to pull the let's say the now pro-independence elite toward a more confrontational approach. So the Catalan parties, or the Catalan pro-independence parties, have never been really able of commanding the pro-independence process. They have been always actually very vulnerable to it. And this, for instance, explains why we saw the events in 2017, in which not just the referendum, but also the events after the referendum, in which at the point Catalan President Puigdemont, he at some point was more willing to call a new election and not do that declaration of independence that obviously was not going to go nowhere, and he, in the end, basically couldn't resist and decided to make this independence declaration and leave the country. So where are we now, or what are the, let's say, the next steps? If we have this very now entrenched territorial conflict, can there be a solution, or what are somehow the next steps? And I think I would be less optimistic than Sandra. I feel that the situation is sort of in a transition period in which it's like in a situation in which it never goes. That's perhaps part of the problem. I agree with Sandra that we are not in a normalized situation, but also we are not in the exceptional situation of 3-4 years ago. And I feel that we can be in this sort of stuck in this stalemate for a while. No one has real incentives to possibly, or no one, or part of the Catalan pro-independence movement and parties really don't want to push more as they did 4 years ago, but at the other side, they are not really willing to backtrack. And on the other side, on the state side, I also don't feel that, even if we see that now the opposition leader is more moderate in the Socialist Party, but again, there's no, I don't feel that the Socialist Party can go far enough to satisfy the demands from the pro-independence side. So we have several situations here. First, in Spain, also in Spain, at the central state level, there's also a very polarized situation. So, for instance, it's very difficult to make any agreement of a sort of constitutional reform to satisfy any demands from part, at least, of the Catalan public without the Spanish right. The Spanish right now is very fragmented, very volatile, and Vox, far-right party, is a strong electoral threat to PP. So I don't think that the right in Spain is in any position to concede any demand from the Catalan pro-independence parties. We also see this fragmentation in Catalonia, in which part of the problem in the last election, even when we have seen these intra-block transfers that have been described, part of the problem is that we still have two very big, or two quite big, pro-independence parties. It seems that no one seems to beat the other one in any single election. They always have, one wins by a small margin. Obviously, in the last election, Esquerra Republicana surpassed Junts per Catalunya, but not with a margin enough to have the confidence of really making a more, or trying to put the region into a more moderate path. And the other way around in Spain. So clearly, we don't see that any of the two sides is strong enough to try to compromise or try to have a more, or really to try to reach an agreement with the other side. And we also have a problem in terms of public opinion. It is true what Sandra mentioned, that the independent support has gone down, but we see I still feel that the public opinion, both in Spain and Catalonia, but also within Catalonia, between the pro-independence bloc or the pro-independence, the pro-independence citizens and the unionist citizens, in terms of the public opinion, perhaps there's also enough distance to expect that someone is willing to, reach an agreement with the other side. Okay, so that makes me less optimistic of, any strong advances in the short term. In the long term, obviously, the situation is not, it's far from stable, and it's far from optimal. So I'm more optimistic in the long term, but I feel that we are going to be stuck in this situation for a while. And yeah, I think I can leave it there. And I'm happy to talk with anyone or answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much for that. That's really insightful. That's helped everyone understand the topic a lot, I think. So yeah, if we go toward the Q&A section, so anyone feel free to just type their questions in the chat whether that be to everyone or to me directly, and I can read them out. I might get the ball rolling with my own. So a couple of you mentioned Scotland as a comparison, as like a comparative issue with the independence movement there. Do you think that Catalonian independence might have to mirror some of the same political factors in Scotland to be, you know, there's a lot of debate whether the Scottish independence is imminent at the minute in the UK. Do you think that they're in a further position toward independence to Catalonia, or maybe there are, in reference to Catalonia? I don't know if that makes any sense, actually. Ignacio, if I direct that towards you.
So, well, I think
or anyone, I don't mind.
I might be a bit provocative here, but I think the comparison with Scotland is very common. But I always feel that it's not like the best comparison, and part of it, and many of you perhaps can correct me, but I feel that in Catalonia the lines between the blocks are, you know, there are some underlying divisions that are very, you know, that are very strong, and that explain very well why someone is pro-independence or against independence. So there's a question of language. So whether your parents are, whether you spoke Catalan at home, that is a perfect predictor of your pro-independence support, and same if you were a Spanish-speaking person. And also income. So it's the support for independence is very much explained by social class. I feel more than in Scotland. So in that regard, my feeling is that in Scotland, the capacity of creating an inclusive majority that could eventually lead for you know, a very massive support for independence, it's more likely than in Catalonia, because the capacity of even in the most extraordinary situations, the capacity of the Catalan pro-independence movement of creating a very inclusive, obviously you know, you look to who supported independence 20 years ago, and now it's a much more diverse crowd. But it is still very much explained by certain predictors. So my feeling is that obviously things can change, but the support for independence has really reached a ceiling. And actually, we see that younger people now don't seem to support more independence than people, you know, that are in their 30s, for instance. So it seems that the new generations are not so enthusiastic about it. So if I had to make beyond the constitutional differences, which are also very important, but I feel that in Scotland, it is much more likely to create, or much more possible to create this very massive, more inclusive, more transversal support for independence.
Can I say something about that, Louise?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I will explain an anecdote from when I was teaching at the University of York. So I was there when the referendum, the Scottish referendum in 2014, and I remember raising that issue with my students, and there was no concern about that. But differently, when I was raising issues about the European Union, there was a lot of debate. So there wasn't an issue that Scotland was, was doing a referendum on independence. That wasn't something that about which students were concerned, and none of them was actually questioning that Scotland was a nation. But in Spain, there is a significant part of public opinion that questions that Catalonia is a nation. So the points of departure, not only in terms of the evolution of the independence, the pro-independence movement, as Ignacio was mentioning, but also in terms of the rest of the society, of the state, where these movements have emerged, it's very different. So I just wanted to mention this anecdote because it's very telling of the very different context in which this territorial conflict is developing in both countries. The fact that the European Union was an issue, whereas Scottish independence wasn't. Whereas in Spain, if you would raise that question among students, you would surely have a very intense debate.
No, thank you both for answering that. That's really interesting, like the difference in how contentious it would be as an issue. So we have another question, if I maybe direct this one toward Caroline. How has government formation worked after the 2021 elections? Has any viable coalition been formed? That's from Theo.
Thanks for that question. We haven't actually so far, no, that there hasn't been a government that's been able to form in Catalonia because of this competition between the two main pro-independence parties. So the Republican left of Catalonia, Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, which got the most seats of the pro-independence parties, is trying to form a government, but so far hasn't managed to. It's had a couple of investiture votes, but the second largest pro-independence party, Junts per Catalunya, has abstained, hasn't wanted to give its support yet because they haven't managed to reach an agreement. So there is this question of, will the Republican left manage to get the Junts per Catalunya on board to form a pro-independence government, or will Catalonia end up going to more elections again? And if they do go to more elections again, the question will be, will it still be this pro-independence versus unionist blocks, or will we eventually see perhaps a left-wing coalition forming across the blocks, as Ignacio and Sandra are pointing to as a possibility? That seems very difficult at the moment, because prior to the Catalan elections in February, the Republican left of Catalonia actually said, we're not going to form any kind of government with the Catalan socialists across the pro-independence unionist divide. So they said they weren't going to do that. But if they don't manage to reach an agreement for a pro-independence government, then the question will return of, will we see alternatives? So it's difficult to see at the moment, and we'll have to see how future attempts at the investiture will go.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive analysis of that. We've got a question from Beth. What are the main reasons behind the shifts in focus on independence from the rise in the 2010s and the decline in the past few years? I don't know if anyone in particular wanted to answer that.
I can do it.
So,
sure. I mean, that's a good question. I think, well, I think it's part of it is sort of fatigue. I mean, Catalonia has lived in an exceptional situation for such a long time that, at some point, it was made obvious that that independence was not going to be achieved in the short term. So that, I think, was part of the problem, that in this process of outbidding, and this thing that I mentioned, that the Catalan elites, political elites, were not able to command the process at all, that basically it was something that they didn't have, they couldn't command, basically created sort of a very extended perception that independence was something that could be achieved, that could be achieved in the short term, and also that the Catalan government could take the challenge until the very end. And eventually, it was made clear that the challenge could be taken to a certain point, but obviously the state ended up reacting. And we can discuss whether there was an overreaction or not an overreaction, but clearly the state reacted. So clearly there was the independence process ended up in a deadlock, that now it's difficult to backtrack, but clearly it's even more difficult to make any further progress in that direction. And I think that explains two things. One is this slight decrease. I wouldn't say it's a very strong one, but there's a decrease in support for independence, and some people perceiving that perhaps a more compromising and approach is necessary here. I also think that part of this is that at least one of the parties, Esquerra Republicana, is trying now to somehow command the process, and it's making very clear, or more clear, clear the message that there needs to be certain, if something wants to be achieved, there needs to be some sort of negotiation with the state, and that obviously makes some people support that strategy. So I think that the combination of new leadership or a new approach from part of the pro-independence bloc that is more willing to compromise, and also some level of fatigue, explains that decline in support for independence. That would be but I don't know whether my colleagues agree.
That's great, thank you for that. So maybe if I direct the continuity of the Scotland question onto Sandra, do you think the creation of Alex Salmond's ALBA party is going to result in us seeing the similar kind of fragmentation of nationalist parties in Scotland as it has done in Catalonia?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's really interesting. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen, but we do know from the literature on political competition that if the same political space is occupied by two similar parties, the dynamics that are going to unfold are going to be dynamics of competition, and it might be likely that results in more radical proposals. So that there is, as I said before, I define it as a race to the top in terms of the demands from the pro independent political parties, and that's what has happened in Catalonia, and that's what the literature on political competition will predict when two political parties are competing for the same political space. So there might be a sort of outbidding dynamic in the future if ALBA's succeeds in gaining a significant part of support among the electorate. If it's a small party, then it's very likely that those dynamics unfold. But if there is over time increasing support, then it might be likely that there is an outbidding competition among the two parties.
Thank you, that's great. And then a question, this might be a nice way to wrap up on, in case unless anyone wants to add anything more. Sammy wants to know, has the way Spain dealt with COVID may influence more people to swing in support of independence? So I suppose, Ignacio, Sandra, you're currently in Spain. I don't know if you've seen that offhand.
No, I don't think actually and I think I said it before in my presentation, that actually the intriguing thing about the last election was that COVID doesn't seem to have any effect on the situation, despite having very low levels of evaluation of the Catalan government. So what we could see in the public opinion data before the election was that the evaluation of the government was very low, that the evaluation of the political situation was not good, or the economic situation. So people had negative views of the context that Catalan society was going through, or the situation, but that didn't seem to have a punishment effect among the incumbent parties, right? So I don't think that COVID has had any sort of impact in the political survival of the government, or in support for independence. Actually, the topic has survived, the conflict has survived, and the support among political parties, well, the support towards each of the blocs has remained pretty stable over time, despite the events related to COVID and the difficult situation that citizens are going through due to the economic consequences of the pandemic.
Can I add something there? So simply one thing that I still always find fascinating, and it never, I never get used to it, is when you look to any public opinion data on the Catalan issue, it's amazing how basically you can almost talk about two different epistemological communities. So it's amazing, and it's very common of any polarized context, but I think in the Catalan one, it's really surprising how people perceive similar events in completely opposed ways. So if you look to opinions on how each, let's say, someone perceives a threat by the Spanish government, it's amazing the level of, level of exposure to a threat, a centralizing threat that the pro-independence people perceive. And then when you talk about, any other policy from the Catalan government, it's amazing how much grievance someone that is against independence perceives. So it's really that very strong polarization basically contaminates any political judgment. And COVID has not been different in this situation. So the evaluation of how well, or actually, it is true that particularly with COVID, that part of the pro-independence supporters do perceive that perhaps the Catalan government has not done a great job, but that has, in this regard, no effect on changing their support. But more generally, any event down in Spain or in Catalonia is really filtered through these very strong lessons.
Just to add something briefly there, and actually the situation in Spain with the regional governments and their powers to control, decide what happens in that region, what what can open, what can't open. That's actually something that, well, regional governments are taking. So that's why Sandra and Ignacio were talking about, attitudes towards the Catalan regional government. So how Spain itself, i.e. the Spanish government, deals with COVID probably wouldn't influence voters so much, because it's actually the regional governments that are deciding very much how the region deals with COVID. So the first lockdown in 2020 was your Spanish government deciding for the country, as it were. But since then, it's been a regional approach, a bit like in the UK, where actually the Scottish government is deciding, the steps out of lockdown for Scotland. Okay, they broadly mirror what the UK government decides, but they're not exactly the same. And it is the Scottish government that decides. So in that sense, it's not just the central government that's on the hook, as it were.
Thank you, all of you. That's a really interesting insight to end on, see how that would kind of play or not play into the mix. Unless anyone has any other questions, I think that might be a good note to finish on. But thank you all so much for coming. It was a really great event, and it was really interesting to hear you all speak, and what you had prepared was very valuable for everyone's knowledge on the topic, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks, Louise, for sharing it. That was great.
Thank you very much, Louise, for moderating, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I hope there is an opportunity in the next months to meet you in person.
Hopefully, I hope so. I hope I can meet you all. Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.